Ariel Zirulnick that has a fantastic background, beautiful. It's not a Zoom background, it's real life. And Yvonne Leow, they're going to talk to us about how they made the membership guide. They work for the membership puzzle, and they made this guide where it's basically a practical and tactical tool for newsroom who want to embark in a membership program. But instead of talking to us about how to do membership, they will talk to us a bit more of an inside view on how actually they made the guide and turn month and month of research and learning into this practical guide. Over to you guys.
Great. Thanks, Federica. Can you hear me all right? Great. Thank you for having us. Super exciting. I miss being able to travel for MPP, so it's really wonderful to get to hop across the pond and present tonight. I am Ariel Zirulnick. I'm the managing editor for the membership guide. I'm also the fund director at the Membership Puzzle Project, which is a public research project studying membership models and news.
Very happy to be here too. My background is also real, but very boring. My name is Yvonne. I was the product manager for the membership guide. I'm also an independent media consultant and the founder of an outdoor adventure company called Bewilder.
So the membership guide, super briefly, because I think many people here are aware of it already. It's a tactical, practical guide to implementing membership. It includes best practices, step-by-step advice, and case studies. It was co-published by us at Membership Puzzle Project and the Lenfest Institute for Journalism in the United States, and it was financially supported by the Google News Initiative. When MPP started thinking about what the membership guide should be back in like late 2019, it was Jay Rosen and I, there were a couple of things that we were sort of considering. The first was that we needed to figure out a way to turn more than 3 years of global research into a useful tool for newsrooms. This is particularly important because at that point in time, MPP was scheduled to sunset in August 2020. And so we were really thinking about how do we make sure that the sort of center of gravity around membership, that everything that we've gathered in the last 3 years remains useful for people without MPP being around as a series of individuals that they could bring their questions to. Another thing that we were thinking about a lot is that membership had gained a lot of traction, but the establishment of best practices was still very nascent and it was very US centric. So we really needed to do a lot more to get this practical knowledge out there outside the United States. And then as we did a field scan across what was already out there around membership research, that field scan revealed that there was very little implementation focused membership research out there. It was still very conceptual in nature and didn't necessarily help newsrooms actually do the thing. And that the case studies that were out there rarely followed what we've taken to calling a membership try long enough to see if it actually worked, and rarely dug into the process enough for others to try it at home. And when I talk about a try, this is something at MPP that we've really thought about a lot. And it's sort of, what is your testable hypothesis about how you can work with your audience members to increase your sustainability and sort of engagement with them? And then, of course, like all of us, the pandemic happened in the middle of this project, or in this case, at the very beginning of the project, before we'd even built out the entire team. And so we had to figure out how to do this multifaceted, incredibly complex project completely remotely, build a team culture, figure out how to go through the user research process and the product development process without ever meeting most of us in person at all. Before we started on the user research process, we established a few sort of guiding principles for the membership guide with our research team. The first one was that we wanted to avoid abstractions. We've talked about that a little bit already, but we knew that the key focus of this needed to be providing applicable knowledge for actually doing membership. There are a few other guiding principles. One that I'll draw your attention to that we've had a lot of questions about since we launched is that we set out to address questions of or issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, and privacy throughout the guide rather than as a standalone section. We did that because we didn't want to make it easy for news organizations to skip these topics over and just sort of pin it for later. I'll come back to this when I have time. And also, we are increasingly encouraging news organizations to understand that these issues are relevant in every step of their organization's development. And so putting it at the guide in the audience research section, in the designing a membership program section, in the product mindset section, that sort of helped to, we think, help drive home the point that this is something that had to be considered at every stage. And in order to execute on that sort of guiding principle of focusing on doing, that is why we undertook the audience research process. If we were going to actually help organizations do the thing, we needed to know what they were missing, what they didn't have in order to accomplish that goal. And so looking at the organizations that MPP has consulted with, who we've spoken to at conferences, and the organizations that we have funded through the Membership and News Fund, we were able to sort of create 6 categories of potential membership guide users with distinctly different needs and constraints and opportunities. I think they're pretty self-explanatory, but the one that I wanted to point out the most is that we put into a separate category newsrooms with membership outside the US and Western Europe, because something that we had learned from supporting organizations through the Membership and News Fund is that they had a very different socioeconomic situation, which they were trying to pitch and appeal membership to people. And so they had a very different set of needs and also a very different level of ecosystem support. A lot of the time, there were not nearly as many accelerators and other types of programs that they could go through to sort of lay the foundation for membership. The user research process, each member of the research team and Yvonne, we each took one of those categories of handbook users and then conducted interviews with 4 to 5 newsroom leaders from each of those types of organizations. And we asked them questions such as, what does membership mean to you in your organization? What is your role? Did anyone hold it before you? Many people in membership concerned roles are the first people to hold their jobs. That really helped us understand how we could help them better. Where do you fit in the organizational structure? How do you measure performance and success? And in the presentation notes for this, which I'll share with Federica and the rest of the team afterwards, we actually provided the template for our user research questions in case you want to see the full list of questions that we asked these organizations. And after concluding one of those user research interviews, we would sort of begin to synthesize it with this grid that you see here on the screen. And our goal was to create a series of user stories for each type of handbook user that we could then use to create a sort of persona for a person who might use a membership guide. And that persona would address things like, what are their motivations for considering or implementing membership? What are their challenges around that? What are their personal goals and what are their organizational goals? And the goal of creating the personas was to make it really easy for us to begin to think about the types of users that we were creating the guide for. And you can see an example of one of those user stories at the bottom of the screen. This came from the publisher of an independent nonprofit newsroom in North America. And she understood that membership was not at a stage where we could tell them exactly what to do, but she wanted help making more educated guesses. And so that was something that really informed the way we talked about our level of certainty of things that we knew or things that we were recommending in the guide. A few key user research findings, and these are things that we wouldn't have necessarily done if we hadn't conducted the user research. The user research also confirmed a lot of our assumptions, but here are a few of the things that it introduced to us. There was a lot of questions about what is the right way to staff a membership effort, and also a lot of concern about burning out membership staff. These are really challenging bridge roles, and we heard particularly from people at the sort of CEO or publisher level that they were really worried about the turnover in those types of roles. So how could we create more support around that? Another thing that we heard that defied one of our assumptions is that people felt like they actually had all the data they needed, but they just didn't know what they should be paying attention to and how to act on it. They needed help sort of cutting the signal from the noise versus collecting the data itself. So that informed some of the ways that we handled our step-by-step processes. And then particularly from organizations outside of the United States, we heard questions about how do you talk about membership? How do you recruit members when being a member becomes an anti-government statement? This is particularly common in sort of repressive media environments, which is increasingly in many countries. And so this is something that we tried to solve for a bit in the guide, is to talk about how to situate an audience needs versus a political statement. Sorry. And the other thing that we did that sort of informed the guide editorially, or the research that we conducted, is we convened a review committee. Our research team was not as representative of the newsrooms that we wanted to serve as we would like. So we also set aside money in our budget to bring together a group of newsroom leaders and organizations that support these types of newsrooms for BIPOC-led newsrooms, small town and rural newsrooms. And we brought them in at 2 key points in the research process to sort of really dig into what we were finding, how we were approaching the work, and point out any gaps in our understanding or gaps in what we were providing. And so what you see here on the screen are a few of the recommendations from the review committee that, again, similar to the user research, we would not have known to solve for if we hadn't conducted the review committee process. The one that I'll draw your attention to as an example is clear advice on how to adapt for single person news organizations. So for those representatives from small town and rural newsrooms, they brought up the fact that many of the people that they worked with are single person newsrooms. And so a lot of the journalism research that is out there assumes that you have a gigantic team and that you're dealing with silos and that you're dealing with who should report to who. And instead, what they needed to know, we have 7 recommendations, what are the 2 recommendations that are most important so they can solve for that as a single person newsroom? And after we had these user personas, after we had these review committee recommendations, we made sure that those moved forward into the design and research in two different ways. To make sure that it was present in the content of the guide, we created a style guide, and that included everything from, are we using American English or British English, all the way down to who are the personas that we're writing for. And we put them in that guide so that the researchers and the editors could sort of hold the drafts against these personas at any stage of the process to sort of hold us accountable to being user-centric. And of course, the user research also informed the design of the guide, which is what Yvonne is going to talk about now.
Well, thanks, Ariel. So what was really fascinating about this project is that we were basically a team of independent contractors kind of coming together to support Ariel and Jay Rosen at the membership puzzle project. And so our designer and developer, which we had a budget for hiring, also were able to riff off of a lot of this user research and get a better sense of what we were creating, especially because we didn't know exactly what the product was going to look like. I mean, we knew it was going to be online and we knew what the goals were, but that was the beauty of doing like the front loading work of investing in the user research and then handing it off to our designer. Our designer was Jessica Fan, who has also a lot of experience working in the tech industry in terms of user experience and designing websites. And she embarked us on a further design discovery process, asking us more questions, particularly for Ariel and myself as the product lead. You know, what exactly is the goal? Like, what do we want people to feel when they actually reach this site? What do we like about other competitors' work? What do we like online that we want to kind of emulate? And then, you know, what will this handbook offer? These were all kind of more like questions almost for us as like the creators to try and figure out exactly what we wanted. And our answer was the problem that we wanted to solve essentially was that, you know, a lot of this information already exists, but it feels very piecemeal. It's disaggregated on the internet, and we wanted to bring it all into one place. So that was like a very important aspect of this. And the goal of doing that is not to create, you know, a 100-page PDF report that we felt like a lot of research ends up looking like in the journalism industry, and we wanted to create more of a tool where people can navigate and very quickly and efficiently find what they want. And so the way that translated into our key features, I'll talk about that, and please encouraging everyone also to ask any questions for after this presentation. Feel free to post it in the Zoom chat. But one of the steps that we did was start to think about how are people going to navigate this site. And one aspect is just purely, you know, the menu. We organize all of this content by membership stages. And we felt like that was the most intuitive because people were either, you know, contemplating about whether or not they wanted to embark on a membership program, or they might be in the middle of like, I'm process of launching one. Maybe there's some insights I could gather from other newsrooms who have already launched one, or they're just trying to figure out how to make membership work. Like they've already launched one and they're not exactly sure what's going wrong, how to even measure success. So that's how we started to structure like this wealth of content that the MPP already had. And one of the ways that we also wanted to make sure that it was like efficient reading was creating this feature for glossary terms. And how this works on the website is that if you hover over certain words like membership strategy, a definition automatically pops up. And what that does is just kind of cuts through the noise. So you could jump into any particular stage of the handbook. But if you didn't know like a term that we were regularly using, like memberful routines, for instance, we already defined that for you. So you didn't have to like backtrack or figure out exactly when and where we defined it. People would be able to very easily kind of just like jump into the guide and figure out where they're at and what these kind of like jargony words end up meaning for them. This was also integrated into just the way that we thought people might be searching for membership knowledge or insights. And so instead of just kind of regurgitating, you know, everything on the web that you could, or on our site that you could find, we really wanted to make it clear that we've created like 3 funnels for people to explore the guide, the handbook, the case studies, and the discussions. Admittedly, the discussions were probably like not as well populated as the number of case studies that we had or the handbook, but we felt that in order for people to really understand like these different tiers of content, we also had to make sure it was reflected in the search results. Then editorial and tone and voice. Like ultimately, we all had the big belief, but myself especially, that the editorial product is the product of the website. Like you can make it look really nice and flashy, but ultimately, like people are going to come for the content, they're coming for the information. And being very intentional about how we shape the tone and voice was something that we also thought through, because there's so much content. We wanted to make sure that there were just like different layers or different methods that people could use to find exactly what they wanted. So we talked about the membership stage navigation at the top menu, but we also created navigation on the right and left. And how does that work? So on the left, you'll see the membership stages, but it also becomes like it expands to actually see what are the particular topics even within a membership stage, because as we know, there's much more to even launching a membership program that you'd want to know more. But then on the right, you could then drill down even further and ask more specific questions about, okay, now that I landed on how to launch a membership stage, I want to drill in and exactly know how other newsrooms have done it and things like that. And so the navigation becomes like even more specific. I'll backtrack one very quickly. I do want to note also that we used intentionally like I, you, we emphasize the we, because I think that also set the standard for MPP. Being as like part of the process, we also wanted to feel like we were there with you in the guide, and not just a you should do this, but very much like if we're trying to create a sense of collaboration here. And also, like, admittedly, there are moments when we do use like we, as in the MPP we, to acknowledge that we might not have all the answers. And there's like a sense of humility in the branding as well. You can jump to branding. So you can see that there's actually not a tremendous amount of contrast in terms of how we branded the membership guide and the membership puzzle project. And that's because we really wanted to build on the trust that MPP had developed in the past 3-some years in the journalism industry, among like all these different types of stakeholders, and make it like that sense of affiliation very clear. So the logo is different, but in terms of the fonts, the colors, we really wanted to build off of what MPP had already designed. And case study filters. And what we did here, we interviewed numerous newsrooms, and we also wanted to make sure that even though we had, again, like a library of knowledge, we wanted to make it easier for people to find what was most relevant to them. And so we broke it down by newsroom type, we broke it down by membership stages, we also broke it down by just the different types of content and editorial focuses that each newsroom had. So that is like another way that we really wanted to make sure the guide was as easy and efficient to read as possible.
I'm going to give you a 2 minutes warning too. So we have a few questions already coming in. So
perfect. Excellent. Thank you, Federica. And so I'll just skip through abandoned features. And so this is also a result of the user research, and realizing that the initial idea was actually to take people through a quiz-like use case flow. So you would be able to, like, similar to this bra company called Third Love, they would quiz women initially, be like, okay, let me find out all this information about you, and then we'll present you with like customized results. And if you go to the next slide, Ariel, it also is like Kayak was also a source of inspiration for that too, where you could enter, okay, I'm at this membership stage, I'm at this, da 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 da. And the reason we abandoned this is because partly we wanted people to be able to discover things that they did not know. And when we were, some senses with Third Love and Kayak, it's very prescriptive in what we think that you should know about membership. And with our guide, you still have access on both sides of the navigation to like all the information that we have. And we're also trying to make it easier so you're not like swimming and scrolling through like a sea of information. So that was kind of like the middle ground that we ended up going with, which I think ended up being a better product, hopefully, for a lot of newsroom stakeholders. But that being said, thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. We have a few questions. So the process for designing the guide seems like a really great model for designing a membership offering. Was that a conscious decision, and what could Newsroom learn from that process?
Ariel?
That's a great point. I think our goal with MPP is in everything that we do, and this is really a tone that was set by my predecessor, Emily Goligoski. MPP was relentlessly user-centric in all of its work, and that was to make the work more impactful, but also to hopefully model for member-driven newsrooms how they should be incorporating people at all stages of the work. So I didn't think about it as a model for designing a membership offering, but I think that this is a way that MPP's research has been undertaken from the beginning. And Emily Goligoski began her research undertakings with user research with several newsrooms around the world who were sort of early adopters of membership.
Thank you. How many people did you interview per user group, and how did you decide when enough was enough?
I can take that one. So this came up during our user research because we also were trying to make sure that we were hitting timelines. And in my previous user research experience, it's really, you want to talk to enough people until you can start to derive insights and patterns of answers. So that number ultimately varies depending on how valuable those interviews were, or the nature of who you're interviewing, what you're trying to learn from them. So sometimes that can take longer or shorter. For us, MPP already had done like a lot of research in the membership stage. So they had basically like pretty strong hypotheses for who they were trying to reach and what they wanted to offer. And we were simply seeking more validation. We probably, each person took on a persona and probably interviewed like around average of 5. And I think like after even 3, you could potentially start to get the same answers if you have like a very clear persona. You can imagine like a local news publisher in the US, for instance, might have a very similar set of problems compared to someone who's just trying to start their own local news outlet. So hopefully that's helpful guidance. I'm not sure if you wanted to add anything, Ariel.
I think that covers it.
Would you share more details about how you coordinated the remote team and how you managed the research process?
Sure. So I think as Yvonne mentioned, I was the only full-time membership puzzle project person. So we were always trying to balance between cohesiveness, but also respecting the fact that everybody else that was on the project was juggling more than the MPP project. At the top level, we had a weekly kickoff meeting every Monday that was about an hour. It was divided into sort of research and product. And there was a pretty like set agenda for that, and people needed to sort of come to me in advance to discuss what they needed to put on the agenda and how we should set time aside for that. It was a lot of one-on-one. I think I had a lot of one-on-one meetings with people to sort of act as the train conductor, again, out of respect for time zones. We had someone in the UK, and then we had Yvonne in San Francisco. So we had a lot of time zones to account for. We are very, very heavy users of Airtable. Airtable filters, Airtable grouping, all of these things sort of saved us as we managed. We interviewed more than 50 news organizations by the end of this process. So even just keeping track of like who has spoken to who, what things do you think are notable out of their interviews? I'm a little bit of a documentation fiend, and that really came through in this process. So I think the short answer is documentation, documentation, documentation. And the other thing that we thought about a lot is, the pandemic, when we started on this and when the team really began coalescing, the pandemic was at its worst in the Northeast United States, where most of the research team was based. And so one thing that we did early on that I really appreciated, and I think built a good remote work culture, especially as we got towards like really intense deadlines, is we started every meeting with a check-in. And it was a moment for people to sort of talk about what's going on with their life outside of that meeting. What do I need to know about how you feel this week so that I can be respectful of a higher level of anxiety, or that your child's homeschool thing has gone totally sideways this week, or whatever it might be. Those check-in moments were to give space for people to sort of talk about what was happening outside the meeting that could potentially affect their work positively or negatively that week, so we could sort of accommodate that. And as the pandemic got less serious, that became a lighthearted place to just like build team culture. I baked 10 banana breads this weekend.
I'll quickly add that I think hiring is very critical. And what I mean by that is I joined, so it's basically Ariel and the research team had already coalesced by the time I joined, and then we then had to bring on an independent, a designer and a developer. And we were also simultaneously in the hiring process considering like an agency versus like an independent designer and developer. And I look back on that hiring process and being like, I'm so glad that we went with the independent designer and the developer, because this membership guide was a little bit startup-esque in the sense that we had to meet pretty regularly in order to kind of stay on the same page. And we also were trying to design something pretty brand new. So we weren't just like putting content on a WordPress site. We were designing like pretty custom features for the guide. And that involved like a lot of flexibility and a lot of demands on what would have been like an agency's dime versus, quite frankly, someone who was a little bit more flexible and just kind of rolling with the punches, in the sense that we didn't always have like a very clear articulated vision. And we needed someone who was like okay with ideating, okay with like fixing bugs over the course of the weekend. And so yeah, I would say like assessing what Ariel described to me was like establishing the right culture for the team and how we wanted to like treat each other, respect each other. Another area I would say is like finding people who then like would fit on that culture was instrumental to making sure this guide like came to completion, because there were many points where that was tested.